I had the opportunity recently to be interviewed for a podcast called Saving the West podcast. I believe it's put on by some people affiliated with NPR. And it was an interview not only with me, but included an environmentalist named Chad Hanson. He runs the John Muir Project, and there's another group that he's also part of. But I've read his writings before in the LA Times. And I can tell you, his view of the world is much different than mine and much different to a lot of you in forested communities in the West. And although we had a good conversation, there were some points that he made that were just so off base. And even though he tries to use I'm a scientist, therefore I look at the data and the data isn't wrong, the data doesn't lie. The problem with that is that he's shaping the data, and the scientists that want a certain outcome, they're looking and cherry picking, in my belief, the data that supports what they want to see. And that's problematic. It's problematic for all of us. You know, at the end, he said, we need to protect our national forests and protect them from logging. And his theory was that areas that were logged left fuel on the ground, it removed the trees, and therefore it burned hotter and worse and more rapidly and was more widespread than areas that had not been managed. And I just couldn't believe it. I'd heard these talking points before. Another one was that when we thin out the forest, it hampers regrowth because now there's not enough shade and it heats up the soil, so you don't see reproduction of trees on that landscape. That's just inherently false. It just doesn't work that way, especially in the Intermountain West, where we have ponderosa pine and western larch that really depend on wide spacings and not having material down below to burn them up. They're fire-resistant species with thick bark that can handle intermittent fire. What we've done is we've fought those fires, and we haven't managed those fuels. So now we have all of these smaller trees coming up, and now they're threatening these trees that in some cases have lived 300-400 years. I think there are some that are even 500 or 600 years old. They've seen centuries of fire. And now we're putting them in danger because there's too much fuel out on the landscape. But getting back to this interview, Chad's view of the world is different than most of ours. The other thing that he said that was really troubling to me was that collaboration in local communities is dangerous. And here's his logic. He said, well, we just have these people from these logging towns and they're dictating what goes on in the national forest. The national forests belong to all of us and they shouldn't be dictating what goes on the ground. The problem with that is that although, yes, Colville, the Colville National Forest, and the Northeast Washington Forest Coalition is a community-based collaborative. However, we have all the regional environmental groups that want to participate participating. That includes local groups like the Kettle Range Conservation Group, the Lands Council in Spokane. We've got the Nature Conservancy all over the world. It's a global group. Conservation Northwest out of Bellingham and Seattle. Sustainable Northwest, which I'm on the board of, also helps facilitate the group. We have lots of people in the community with varying interests, many of which are not timber. And they provide their input based on their interests, and we come up with solutions on the ground with the Forest Service to try to create a healthy forest while at the same time creating beneficial economic growth, recreation, grazing, and other things that these forests can be used for. Now, before we start just saying, okay, let's use the forest, we're talking about specific areas in the forest that already have roads, that are near communities, and we're managing those. These have been managed in the past, and we're helping get them back to a more natural condition and manage them that way in perpetuity. Now, we have other lands that are kind of between the actively managed lands and the backcountry. I'll get to the backcountry in a minute. But those middle lands are an area that we call our restoration zone, or a restoration area. And when I say we, that's our Northeast Washington Forest Coalition. And basically what that is we want to manage that in some sort of gradient. As it's closer to the communities and there's more need for forest restoration and active management, we treat it that way. But we do it in a collaborative process. As it gets closer to the backcountry or is in less need, then that gets left alone, or a light touch management. Now for the backcountry. So the backcountry includes wilderness, it includes inventoried roadless areas, and other high mountain areas that are typically right at the tree line in Northeast Washington, or areas that just don't have roads and haven't been managed in the past. Some of those areas are controversial because there are some old roads in there. But what we're doing is we're trying to create a discussion to figure out what we should do there. I think it would be a good practice for local collaboratives to really have that land allocation discussion, because I think what it does is it allows you to talk about what's going on in your forests without overlapping. Because if you have environmental concerns there, somebody that's really pro-wilderness, and you start talking about actively manage and logging and thinning and all these things that are going on, they're going to be put off because they're going to be thinking to themselves, well, are you cutting the forests that I hold dear? And that's where we get into this rub. So we need to talk about interests rather than positions, think of the forest in terms of abundance rather than scarcity. If we do that, we can come to some really good agreements on what needs to go on. And ultimately, if we can manage the forest appropriately, then we can reduce the fire danger, reduce the smoke that we're dealing with, and everybody benefits. But getting back to that podcast I had with Chad Hanson, I don't know whether Chad or those that follow his type of thinking are interested in a discussion, or if they're plainly set on no logging whatsoever on our federal lands. I would hope that there's some collaborative balance that we can have there, and rather than just hiding behind science as it tells us what we need to know and that's it, and he claims to be a forest ecologist, and I have no reason not to believe him. But I've talked to lots of forest ecologists, fire ecologists, others, environmentalists, and we know what needs to go on the landscape. And each landscape's a little different. And so local knowledge is important, but also taking into consideration that this is a national forest, it's federally owned, and we need to manage it appropriately. That doesn't mean that somebody somewhere should be able to hold everything hostage if they don't agree. And I think that's where the key concern becomes. Because we've got a choice here. We can collaborate and come up with a collective set of agreements and manage these forests appropriately, or we can continue to argue over them and then wait till an administration comes in that's pro-management and then just go to management. And then everybody that's pro-conservation is going to be wringing their hands and concerned. And then once the administration comes in that's pro-conservation or pro-wilderness or pro-protectionism, if you will, those things are going to happen. We need to depoliticize this whole land and forest management debate. I think we need to manage for the rule and not the exception. And I think that's what we've been doing for so long, is we've been concerned about the exceptions, the problems or specific areas out in the forest that we don't want to touch it because we could cause a problem with that. Instead of managing for the rule and identifying the exception and putting them in the appropriate place. If we can do that, then we can manage these forests appropriately. We can have the social license to get out there and manage these forests in a way that represents what almost every American wants to see out there. It benefits the community, it benefits the forest, it benefits everybody. So that's my goal and the way I look at things. Hopefully you agree. If you don't, we'd love to communicate about that. But I appreciate your attention. And once that podcast comes out, I'll highlight it and we can talk about that as well. Thank you very much.